As is becoming something of a running theme at this point, one of the first birds we spotted in Langkawi was the common kingfisher. For this species at least, common is absolutely the accurate appellation. Thankfully, it wasn't long before we spotted something new to us in the form of the collared kingfisher, which has a number of notable differences from the common kingfisher, notably being about half again as large, double the weight, and of course having a notably larger and thicker bill. Being a larger bird, it is perhaps unsurprising that their dietary requirements and the food they are able to predate upon is slightly wider than that of the common kingfisher. This individual, for example, is currently attempting at least to eat a snail, but the species has been recorded taking anything up to small snakes, lizards, and sometimes even small birds and mice. And it is this adaptability that may explain why they are so common, indeed abundant, in their home range. It wasn't just the kingfishers, though, that were very similar to species we've seen in other places around the world. This bird, for example, was immediately identified as a bulbul, and it took some research to determine that it is in fact the yellow-vented bulbul, which is widespread across Indochina and the Philippines. It is notably distinct from the bulbuls we observed in South Africa due to the lightly coloured face, giving it a masked and crested look. And likewise, very similar to the European bee-eater, we also spotted the chestnut-headed bee-eater. Interestingly, unlike the European bee-eater we've recorded previously, this species actually lacks the elongated central tail feathers that makes many of the other relatives of the bee-eaters so distinctive. The next species we spotted, the greater racket-tailed Drongo, a particularly distinctive bird, and it must be said, one that is quite difficult to get the camera's autofocus to track properly. Amazingly though, it is not their incredibly showy tail feathers that makes the Drongo quite so spectacular. One of their most striking traits is not visual at all, as they have an unusually wide range of calls they can make, many of which are perfect mimics of other birds. There are a number of theories as to why this behaviour occurs, the two most prevalent of which are 1. That mimicking calls of other birds aids in the formation of mixed species foraging flocks, which Drongos are often seen as part of, and 2. That mimicking the calls of other birds aids them in their commonly observed habit of stealing insect prey from other species they forage alongside. And for this episode's gratuitous slow-mo shot, we have the little spider hunter, which, despite the name, is in fact a nectar-feeding bird in the sunbird family, and for reasons best known to itself, this individual is building a nest over the entrance to a shopping mall. As striking as many of the birds found on Langkawi are to look at, much like the Drongo, it is their calls that makes them incredibly interesting subjects to film. One of the more distinctive and recognisable calls in Langkawi is that of the zebra dove. The oriole is also common in the pet trade in Southeast Asia, partly due to their bright coloration, but also, again, due to their particularly distinctive calls, which actually vary heavily between subspecies. Even the wading birds are in on it, with this red-wattled lapwing being particularly vocal. But when it comes to calling, without a shadow of a doubt, this next species, the Indian or common Mynah, is absolutely the ruler of the roost. Due to its intelligence, adaptability, and the actions of humans, the common mynah is one of only 3 birds on the list of 100 worst invasive species, as defined by the IUCN. They do not appear to cooperate with birds, or indeed steal their food, such as the Drongos have been seen to, so it is unclear why the mynahs can vocalise as widely as they can. But we observed one particular individual mimicking at least 4 different species calls. Moving up in scale just a little, one of the more exotic species we observed on Langkawi was the first hornbill we would see in Southeast Asia, namely the Oriental pied hornbill, which may also be known as the Sunda pied hornbill or the Malaysian pied hornbill. And perhaps surprisingly, the Oriental hornbill is actually considered to be among the smallest and most common of the Asian hornbills. Although it must be said, when we're talking about a bird that is up to about 60 centimetres long, head to tail, of which in the males up to 19 centimetres may be bill, that itself can weigh up to a kilogram, small perhaps is not the right word to be using. While the Oriental hornbill is nominally frugivorous, generally picking a number of common trees within their local region, from which to feed on almost exclusively, they have also been known to take small birds, small reptiles, amphibians, and even bats. This particular behaviour actually took us some time to work out. It wasn't until, upon closer inspection after the hornbills had departed, we noticed that the small white sac on the side of this structure appears to contain some form of insect or larva that apparently the hornbill were trying to eat. Langkawi is also home to some really quite significant raptors, first and foremost of which is the Brahminy kite, or red-backed sea eagle, which may in fact be where the island and archipelago get their name. As in colloquial Malay, Lang, the shortened form of Helang, means eagle, and Kawi is a red stone used as chalk to mark goods. But as impressive as the kites are, the top of the aerial food chain in Langkawi is very much the white-bellied sea eagle. Where the Brahminy kite maxes out at about half a metre long, with a 1.2 metre wingspan and weighing about 2/3 of a kilogram, the white-bellied sea eagle can be up to 90 centimetres long, with a 2.2 metre wingspan, and can weigh around 4.5 kilograms, making them significantly threatening in the skies. Although considered to be of least concern of extinction globally, parts of its range have been so heavily disrupted by human activity that it is considered threatened in Victoria and vulnerable in South Australia and Tasmania. The population is declining in Thailand but is not yet considered a concern. And on Langkawi, the birds display a number of interesting behaviours. Normally, the juveniles are very dispersive, and the adults are highly territorial, with an adult or pair of adults jealously guarding their territory and preferred nesting sites. However, on Langkawi, occasionally very, very large flocks of mixed white-bellied sea eagles and Brahminy kites can be observed. And we observed and filmed this behaviour ourselves whilst out on a tour. We didn't immediately realise exactly what was happening, Being as distracted as we were by the significant number of predatory birds circling overhead. But we soon spotted that some of the other tour boats were in fact throwing out food for the birds, encouraging them to swarm in this fashion and to dive down to the surface of the water. We would not normally include such footage, however, we do feel it's important to show sometimes the impacts that human activity have on these species, and to say that under carefully controlled situations, of which it must be said this does not appear to be the case, this can be highly beneficial in assisting the recovery of a threatened species.